Kia ora, and a warm welcome to the Kia Speaker Series. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tina from Kia. A warm welcome to everyone from around the world. Today, we are speaking about navigating the next decade. We hear a lot in the news about risks and about doom and gloom, but what if that's not the whole story? What if we're at the beginning of a growth supercycle? We have a conversation with three people around the world who have different perspectives. We have Anna Fifield joining us from Wellington. We have Roger Dennis joining us also from Wellington, but normally in Christchurch. And we have Reuben Steff joining us from Brno. We have Anna, a journalist, Roger, a futurist, and Reuben, an academic and geopolitics expert. I'll be in the background monitoring the Q&A, so pop in your questions and I will pass them on. I'll duck into I'll hide from view right now and I'll hand over to Anna and leave you in very good hands with Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, and kia ora koutou. Welcome to this resurgent Kia speaker series. I'm very happy to be moderating the panel today. We do have the questions open and you'll be able to see them in the chat and upvote them if you want, and Tina will be sending them to us. So please do ask your questions and I'll make sure that we get to them. So this is quite a contrarian topic we're discussing today. As Tina said, so much doom and gloom in the world. The dominant narrative today is one of fragmentation, of conflict, uncertainty. But the provocation for the speakers today is, what if we are misreading this moment and about to start an extraordinary period of growth? How can we, as New Zealanders, either at home or out in the world, thrive in volatility? So to start us off on this subject, I'd like to ask Roger and Reuben, first of all, to tell us, what is a supercycle? Roger, why don't you start?
Sure. So supercycle is a relatively new term that describes decades of structural growth. And you can see a recent example of this with China's ascension on the world stage, particularly from an economic point of view, where from the early 2000s, really for a couple of decades, it has grown to the point where it's become quite dominant in a number of fields around the world. So really going from something which is a standard economic cycle into something which is quite different. One of those would also be post-World War II rebuilding programs.
Great. Reuben, anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess to some degree, we're being a bit contrarian here right now, given that the dominant kind of, I think, mode of thought is that most of us feel a bit anxious. We're uncertain about the future. Things seem unpredictable. There are wars breaking out, geopolitics, the end of history, and so on. But I mean, what happened in the 1920s is you had like a roaring cycle back in the 1920s. You had actually the end of the pandemic. Coming out of that, you had lots of social activity, people taking risks. But on top of that, you had actual technological changes. You had electrification. You had the automobile. You had new production, machine factories coming online. And we now are kind of similar to that. Like, yes, we're coming out of a pandemic and it feels like there is not a roar happening, even though there is global growth occurring. But we have artificial intelligence, right? We have a boondoggle, giant investments going into data centers, going into the need for redundancy and resiliency. So as the world becomes both like kind of fragmented as a result of this geopolitics, as a result of multipolarity, that means countries and companies, they don't just want one thing. They don't just want one factory and one source of supply. They want multiple sources of inputs, multiple factories, multiple supply chains, multiple trusted, reliant partners they can rely upon, and so on. So we might be setting up for something like that as well right now.
Right. Okay, great. So what do each of you see as the key forces shaping the next decade? In addition, like Reuben, you just mentioned AI there. What else should we be expecting and preparing for?
So the thing that I'm watching here is that there's a whole number of drivers, but at a macro scale, I'm looking at a cascade between technology, jobs, and politics. And those three are closely linked. So effectively, when you see headlines about fast-moving technology, that could be AI or robotics, typically the next set of headlines is around employment. And when you see employment headlines, politicians tend to respond. So with these structural changes in these fast-moving technology areas, you can see how the cascade flows right through the system. And above all of that, above those three cascades, climate change is one as well that I'm watching very closely.
Reuben?
Sure. So I'll set aside climate change, but like if you think of defense, I mean, there's going to be $3 trillion in 2026 going into the military across the world. Like a global rearmament is underway. Alongside that, you have energy and you have technology. And you can think of these as three different stories of investment going on, but they're all mutually reinforcement. They're all one story. Whether it comes to kind of a technology like AI, that requires power, which is an actual capital, material investment. It requires secure semiconductor supply chains. And then if we switch to advanced energy systems, because we want to get off fossil fuels and so on, well, that requires software, sensors, critical minerals. If you switch then to military investments, defense investments, that increasingly depends upon artificial intelligence, space infrastructure, communications, and energy. All these things are intersecting into one another.
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, I'm really interested to hear more about that and the opportunity in particular for New Zealand companies to find opportunity and growth amid this chaos. Would either of you care to expand on maybe defence in particular, and energy, where New Zealand could find opportunities here?
Sure. So at the highest level, as a nation, we tend to do well in very weird, specialised niches. If you look at examples of that, recently we have online accounting software, we have electronic GPS collars for cows, we have become one of the world's leading launchers of satellites. Now, those are not, widespread, massive scaling terms of industries. They are quite defined. We're a nation of 5 million people. We can't take on other sectors around the world at the scale that other countries can provide. So it's these really quite well-defined niche areas which tend to pop up, I'd say, without a high level of predictability. So, for example, in Wellington, there's a fusion startup called OpenStar, which is getting international headlines. 10 years ago, you never would have predicted that that was on the horizon. Halter, the massive company now that does the GPS electric collars for cows, 10 years ago, once again, you wouldn't have predicted that. So I think as a nation, we do very well in small niche industries. And there are examples in each of those ones that Reuben's talked about where there is potential for us to have quite significant growth. Mm-hmm. Reuben, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've also got to realize in New Zealand itself right now, we are going to be increasing our defense spending from 1% to 2%, which, look, this is very belated. We should have done this a long time ago. Nonetheless, we are doing it now. But that basically accounts for an additional 9 billion of spending in the next few years. And this is going to go into uncrewed vehicles, space technologies, and increased defense science funding. The New Zealand government for years has not wanted to talk about anything military, defense, industrial related because it results in connotations of the military industrial complex and what have you. But the New Zealand government is now talking about the need for a sovereign defense industrial base to feed into helping the New Zealand Defence Force rejuvenate itself. And that's not just going to be getting New Zealand companies plugging into the New Zealand Defence Force, but also plugging into all this investment going on abroad internationally. So there's just massive potential right now. There's all these dual-use companies we have in New Zealand. I mean, I have a new report coming out, not to plug myself, but I guess I will. It's a report that's coming out, that's actually just come out, about defence, artificial intelligence, and the New Zealand Defence Force. And I have a bit about the dual-use defence AI ecosystem in New Zealand. It has about 50 companies that a lot of them are like focused on commercial and civilian purposes, but they all have defense related applicability. So New Zealand itself is now intentionally trying to build up a kind of industrial system that can plug into all the stuff happening internationally, but also about our own domestic defense force.
Just on that, that's very interesting. I mean, obviously, there's this taking place in this big global rearmament, like you say. Do you think, I mean, this is very controversial in New Zealand, right? Do you think that the New Zealand government has built enough or has the social license to embark on these kinds of changes and that would enable New Zealand companies to capitalize on them?
Well, it's interesting that, like, if you look at the polling, and there's not a lot of polling about these things,
Yeah.
but if you only go back a few years, defense was always way at the bottom of New Zealanders' like list of priorities. But more recently, the last 2, 3 years, if you look at polling, and New Zealanders actually want to see more money going into defense, and that's quite a rare and unusual thing. But I think they're just reading the tea leaves. They're seeing what's happening internationally. They're seeing every day in the media what's happening, and they're going, okay, we need to start responding to this. So I actually do think they have the social license now. And if you even just look at the things that the ACT Party is saying, and look, set aside any political view you have, but the ACT Party, New Zealand First, they're all starting to say things that are kind of more robust, more pointed about what's happening internationally and how New Zealand should respond. And I suspect it's because they're seeing the polling is heading that way as well. So I think the social license is getting there quite belatedly.
And to paraphrase the head of a European intelligence agency, something about 18 months ago, many New Zealanders may not be interested in geopolitics, but geopolitics is interested in us.
Well, New Zealand got down to like 6 days of diesel fuel recently because of the war in the Middle East. And that's all predictable. The fact we're going to see more wars, we're going to see more instability, more unpredictability. I mean, I was talking about this 5 years ago, and finally people are catching up.
Yeah, and I mean, because of all these factors, I think we're going to see geopolitics and foreign policy on the election agenda this year in a way that is very unusual for New Zealand. So I think it does, to your point, Reuben, feel very, very real to us now. We are geopolitically ever more aligned with the kind of US and the Western global order, as opposed, we hear a lot from China in particular about the multipolar world order. Do you think that geopolitical alignment determines our economic opportunity as we move forward, or will there be more opportunities for countries like New Zealand in a multipolar world?
Reuben?
I was about to say, Roger. Look. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are more centers of power, more centers of capital, more companies. There are more entities out there seeking diversification, and New Zealand can plug into all of this. At the same time, you see kind of a collapse between the security dimensions and the economic dimensions. So there's going to be certain areas where our preferred partners, and let's be honest, it's Australia, it's America, it's the Western world, and then Asian allied partners. There's going to be certain technologies, certain industrial and production capabilities. You can't play all sides, okay? Like, our military is not going to be able to have communication systems that come from China or Russia. It's just a fact, okay? The world is starting to split into something that looks a bit like blocks from the Cold War. It's not as exclusive, it's not as discrete, but there's going to be certain areas where you have to be on one side or the other. But there's going to be other areas where it doesn't matter, where you can sell, you can export to different countries, different centers of power.
And building on that point, the need for agility and diversification means that, sort of reinforce something Reuben mentioned earlier, you need to get away from this just-in-time mentality, which has really worked very well in an era of stability. And so in an era of stability, you could understand what was coming through the supply chain, when it would arrive with high degrees of certainty. Now all that's gone. So if you're going from just in time to just in case, not only in supply chains, but also thinking about market diversification, then as a nation, we should be smaller and more nimble and agile on the world stage. We do not have a federal state split. We have this history of fairly rapid innovation in terms of core industries, but we need to go a lot faster in that space and break out of this mentality of sort of, well, we can muddle through and we'll just see what happens. The challenge there is that most leaders around the world, not just in New Zealand, have grown up in this era of stability. And all the frameworks and mental models and management strategy plans that they've used to implemented in that time of stability are no longer appropriate for this era we're in now. And so you have to fundamentally rethink how you seize opportunity in an era of severe global volatility. Just clinging on to things you've always done, either as a nation or as a company, will not work in this current global environment.
Yeah, look, I'll just add quickly as well. You've got to be comfortable with moral ambiguity. For the last 20, 30 years, we've been at the end of history. We've just thought New Zealand is this benign, happy little country. Everyone loves us and we love everyone else and everyone loves each other. Turns out that's not the case, that we were all kind of asleep. Other countries have ramped up and they are now reacting. And we, as a little trade-dependent country at the bottom of the world, we sometimes are going to have to do deals that we might be like, oh, not sure about the morality of this, but nonetheless, we're going to have to take what we can. We are going to be takers. We can't be givers, really. This is a fraught environment we're going into. It's a transactional environment. It's multipolar, where all sorts of countries are playing off one another, and we are going to kind of have to do the same, and we just have to accept it.
Speaking of countries playing off one another, I do just want to jump in and give an update. It's still 0-0 in the Spain versus Argentina game. I did want to acknowledge that there is something else happening on screens elsewhere at this time. So nothing to see there, so we can continue. Also, just to remind you, if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat. So just riffing off what you just said then, Reuben, can you each or give us examples of either companies or countries that are adapting and are learning to thrive in volatility and chaos?
Sure. So if you look back to a time when the world was also in chaos at an amplified level in terms of COVID, you see some really interesting examples of organizations that had done some structural work and were poised to take advantage of something they couldn't see coming. So the absolute classic is the medium we're using now, which is Zoom. So pre-pandemic, Zoom was a small, struggling company. And then as soon as people started needing to work from home, it just went gangbusters. So agile, small, able to pivot around in a way that the larger IT companies were just caught short on. So you didn't see Microsoft, for example, roll out a video conferencing tool at speed. It was Zoom was the default for many months. And as a result, that company just grew and grew and grew. So there's something around size, something around preparation, and I think something around mindset of organizations.
Mm. Reuben, do you want to add anything on that, or should we?
Yeah, I mean, we have the quintessential story of Rocket Lab, that some dude just in his backyard decided to start figuring out how to shoot some rockets off. I mean, incredible story. And it turns out the space industry is a booming thing. So I guess that's the thing. Like, can you think of something that we don't yet know that we are gonna need very soon? And actually, like, you probably can do this in certain areas, right? Once the established assumptions break down, once the commercial potential emerges, if you can think of so OpenStar is another example. Like, we all think like fusion technology is going to be a big thing. So if you can find a way to do that cheaper, more efficiently in a new mechanism, well, that could be $1 trillion company, not just $1 billion one. Something like OpenStar literally could be $1 trillion company in the future, just like Rocket Lab may very well be eventually. Um, yeah, so I'm not like one of these people building these companies, but if you are entrepreneurial, if you're thinking of the future, what do you think humanity might need in the coming years or decades? And you think you have a leg up or an entrepreneurial or innovative spirit towards, please go for it. Like New Zealand needs as many entrepreneurs thinking like that as it can.
And does our kind of geographical distance or natural resources offer an opportunity for international companies to invest in New Zealand in some of these niches and some non-traditional areas?
So there's an interesting precedent here that not many Kiwis know about. So Google at one point had an arm of the organization that was running lots of experiments at speed. And it would have been, 2013, 2014, one of the experiments they were running was called Loon, Loon. And it was this idea that you could put weather-type balloons into sort of suborbital space. So they would just be high enough so they could, move around at a certain speed, and they would have telecommunications infrastructure on them. And they were sort of doing like a pre-Starlink idea where they could bring internet connectivity at low cost to certain areas around the world by using weather balloon type infrastructure. And they did a global search on where was the best place to do this. Turned out the South Island of New Zealand was ideal. I spent some time talking to the head of that project when they were in New Zealand, and there were a couple of really interesting things they said. So first of all, they said high level of trust. So when they put on the crate coming into the country, the list of materials that was in the crate, generally we said, okay, that's great. We trust you. The second thing was a nimble regulatory environment. So they talked to the regulators, and they could actually talk directly to them, not go through layer after layer after layer, and actually find out if it was possible to launch these balloons. And then we had this geographical unique perspective where you could launch a balloon from the Southern Lakes and would pass around the world, only going across one other geography in South America. So they only had to get one other set of permissions for the balloon to overfly. So what I found fascinating about this was that countries around the world would have paid Google tens of millions of dollars to have that project based in their own location, because Google flew in 20, 30, 40 PhD computational geniuses to work on this project any one time, spent millions in the country, and most Kiwis had no idea it was even there. But Google selected that location as the best place in the world to do it for some different reasons. I don't think we capitalized on that enough.
Yeah, I was going to say, what happened to that?
It turns out that things like Starlink were much more effective, and Google quickly looked at the economics of it and the viability and decided it wasn't going to fly. No pun intended.
Literally.
So they killed the project off. It was an experiment, but it was really interesting from my point of view to see that. And at one point, like I'm always watching BBC every day, number one headline in the BBC one day was Google tests new balloon technology in New Zealand, and still most Kiwis were totally unaware that was going on.
Yeah. I was going to make a snide comment about the New Zealand media, but I won't. I'll restrain myself. Reuben, Roger brings up a good point there about the South Island and how seems like so much of the next gen tech and geostrategic stuff is based in the South Island. Is that something that you've been keeping an eye on?
Just to reinforce that, the South Island is probably the ball game for New Zealand right now. Yes, our big economy is in Auckland in the north, but in the South Island, you have renewable energy, we have sparse aerospace, we have it's almost uninhabited actually, productive agriculture, cool climate, Antarctic access, location suited for aerospace, communications, data infrastructure. It's fantastic down there, and we have companies down there. Dawn Aerospace, Kia Aerospace, Sios, who are now like a drone company that's also in the UK and Ukraine. Christchurch is one of the South Island is one of the few places that can access Antarctica, the Americans have a base or like an office in Christchurch Airport. We fly reshipments or like restocking operations every year with the Americans down to our bases and the American bases down in Antarctica. And there's been all this excitement about the Antarctica in recent years. Eventually, there's going to be a lot of excitement as to what's happening down in Antarctica and the resources down there. And again, this is where we kind of need to step away a little bit from what we want to believe or how we hope the world works. But look, the world is going to head towards a future of renewable energy, but also massive fossil fuels for decades to come. And in Antarctica, there's giant amounts of energy, and companies are going to be looking for that in future decades. That's just the way it is. So I think the South Island is a fantastic kind of strategic location, even though we don't think of it like that. I just think there's massive potential. And look, sometimes companies are going to be interested, and it's not going to work out. They're going to come down. They're going to survey. They're going to think about it. They're going to spend millions, billions of dollars. But that's fine. If it works out, that's amazing for us. If it doesn't work out, nonetheless, there's still attention and investment going into our country.
Yeah. What's the biggest challenge for us right now? What's the biggest risk that we face in not capturing this potential or this share of growth in a supercycle?
The biggest challenge, I would say, is the dominant mindset and actually having the ability to think through different scenarios to position yourself well. Typically, what I find in dealing with both government and private sector, and this is around the world with the exception of probably Singapore and a handful of the Nordics, is that the system of democracy tends to reward reaction, not proactive thinking, and actually having contrarian views about scenarios that no one's really considering never really lands well. And so the biggest risk as a country we face is not thinking through the scenarios very well, like having a structured foresight process which is rigorous and world-class, where you can actually say, here is something we should be thinking about. We're not quite sure how that might work, but we can see there are opportunities sitting there. To Reuben's point, how might we structure some of our responses so that when the tea leaves start to change, you can read those and start to seize on it before somebody else does?
Yeah. And Roger, you and I have talked a lot about Singapore and what a great job it does in terms of that scenario planning, horizon scanning that we just don't do in government here.
No. And Singapore has a different government structure which allows that to happen, but there are many more similarities around the process they've been through to institutionalize that, which are very rich learnings.
Yeah. Reuben, did you want to add anything on that?
I don't know. It's tricky. I mean, the beauty of democracy is that we deliberate and we do things slowly in the hopes that we can moderate the risk out there. The danger is that just we have these levels upon levels of bureaucracy. And I worked in the government before I became an academic, and I just saw a lot of time being wasted and multiple levels of bureaucracy that I was like, why the hell is all this going on? So we don't want to give up what makes a democracy accountable and able to manage risk. At the same time, I think when we do just have what we think is an opportunity, even if there's high risk, we just got to cut through it. We've got to find a way. Like, you need some mechanism to do it. So that's what I'd say. I think we see this across the Western world these days. If you look at the polling, I mean, huge amounts, a majority in, I think, 16 of the world's richest democracies right now, like 56% are unhappy with the way the democracies are working. That's for a variety of reasons. But in New Zealand, it's also certainly the case that most people just don't feel like it's working as effectively and efficiently as it should be. I can't disagree with them.
Right. So if the two of you separately were advising the government, the cabinet, the prime minister right now, and to advise them what they should do over the next, say, decade or 5 years even, to take advantage of this environment, what would you suggest we do? What would your advice be, Roger?
That's relatively straightforward, which would be set up a world-class foresight program that echoes what Singapore has done and copies some of those key aspects, both from Singapore and a handful of other corporates and countries which actually have foresight at the core of some of their long-term decision-making processes, and then think about how you would purpose that for our environment. And then to Reuben's point, how do you make it immune from democratic meddling so that it becomes the heart of decision-making? You introduce some of those contrarian views, you bring agility and resilience into the process, and then you also start to get to almost like a grand strategy view where the government and private sector are working closely together to actually figure out where you can go faster, where opportunity sits, how to remove some of the barriers to moving at speed where you need to. And this isn't something which is new. If you look back at previous crises in the country in recent history, after the Christchurch quakes, a whole bunch of officials didn't bother waiting for permission from central government. They just moved at speed to create a response which was suitable for the size of the crisis. During the pandemic as well, what you saw was layers and layers of bureaucracy just bypassed to move at speed. So as a nation, we can move fast, but there are these sort of institutional barriers around, we can't do that, we've always done it this way, that's not how we work, why are we thinking about that? We can do it internally, we don't need to look around the world to find out. All this stuff exists. You need to have this really solid foundation of understanding where the world might go, having these difficult and challenging conversations, getting public sector and private sector working together to actually start to realize some of the opportunity and mitigate the risk.
Great, thank you. Reuben, what would your advice be to Christopher Luxon or whoever comes next?
I'd completely double down on what Roger said again. I want to see bipartisan approaches to things. I don't care about the centre left and centre right. I don't think the average Kiwi cares anymore. Big things are happening. We need big investments. We need the foresight, the long-term thinking. I mean, I think every single New Zealander just about would agree with that. Maybe you have people on the fringes, far left and far right, but you know what? I don't care. Sorry, guys, you're on the fringes. You are not really representing probably the 80% majority of New Zealanders who want to see New Zealand position itself to make the investments, to have the thinkers, to have the capital coming in. So I just completely double down on everything Roger said. He said it very eloquently then. We just need that. We need leadership amongst the majority of the political parties in the centre to get together and go, this thing, we can all agree to that, we can all agree to that, we can all agree to that over the next 10, 20 years. And we're all going to say, irrespective of who wins the next election, we are going to all abide by it. That's just the way it has to be, I think. Otherwise, New Zealand's just going to be stuck in this kind of state of non-stop discussion, debate, deliberation, reverse. We'll pay consultants to do things, then we'll reverse when the next government gets in. This is an absurdity. We keep doing it, and we're not going to get anywhere this way.
So we've talked a bit here about the attributes that are holding us back or constraining our mindset. What are the Kiwi attributes that could help propel us forward or that could position us well for the next decade?
So if you look at an industry we've already talked about, which is aerospace, then what really surprises me in a good way is how many aerospace companies there are now operating in this country. And it's a really tight cluster of connected individuals, each who have sort of spotted a niche within a niche. So we don't have two companies doing satellite launches. We have quite a differentiation between Rocket Lab, Dawn, Kia, and others. And some of the niches they're working in now are quite collaborative. And I think the size of our nation means that is a competitive advantage. This sort of, 2 degrees that we have in the country really can be leveraged to be quite a game changer. A couple of other things. There's this myth that we have a number 8 wire mentality. I think that's gone years ago. That came from an era of geographic isolation where you had to reinvent stuff. But I think the key thing is size, agility, And also, to some degree, and I say this in the best possible way, like complete ignorance. Like, yeah, we can do like a fusion startup in Wellington. Yeah, we can launch satellites in New Zealand. Why not?
Indeed. Indeed. Reuben, how does it look from there, from looking back at home from Europe?
I don't know. I mean, I'd just say that people like us around the world, and we're never going to have the domestic capital to truly fund a lot of these things. That's why we have a lot of companies that are emerging or startups that have to rely upon external international buy-in. But we need more of that, quite frankly. We need more of that, the diaspora network to help us out. We need more of the people that have done very well in New Zealand and now float around internationally that sometimes come back to New Zealand and, proclaim to be interested in what's happening here, to be thinking, actually, okay, how can I connect my international network to the domestic network? And one thing that does give us a leg up there is that people like New Zealanders, Kiwis, we're quite open, we're naive, and that does give us an entryway into some of these conversations. Maybe we're not the best sometimes in those conversations, putting ourselves forward, because again, we're pretty, I don't know what I'd say, but we're down to earth. So I just think there's something about the international diaspora and the New Zealand innovative potential and people that want to get ahead, so to speak. I think there's some connectivity there that could be done.
Yeah, that segues really nicely into my next question, which was about how should New Zealand use its global diaspora differently over the next decade, and how, if you're a Kiwi overseas, as many people on this call are, where can you create the most value for yourself and eventually back home for us here in New Zealand?
So I think there's something around the power of networks in areas that you might not otherwise be able to reach, where you can pick up weak signals before anybody else does through these sort of loose conversations. I've seen something happening here that doesn't quite, match the pattern. What would it mean for this? I can see someone doing this over here. The power of the network and loose connections should not be underestimated. And having those conversations with other people in the network, I think, is really important. I think it's important for two things, both realizing opportunity and also mitigating risk, two sides of the coin. Reuben, as an expat yourself now living overseas, you have some informed commentary, no pressure.
Well, a little bit. I mean, I'm only living overseas now for 5 or 6 months, but I guess it's a bit like, you want to ask a girl or a guy out for a date. You've got to just sometimes be like, okay, there might be an opportunity here, and hey, why not take the risk? And again, like, why not put yourself forward, make the pitch, and see what happens? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Someone says no, and who cares then? Just go on for your life. I guess I'd say that, like us as, again, I think us as Kiwis, we're pretty down to earth. We have a soft culture. We don't often want to really assert ourselves at all. We don't want to be controversial. But we live in this global world of competition and things happening everywhere. And you've just got to sometimes try it. So that's what I'd say.
Great. So as we start to wrap up now, it is still 0-0. So we can probably get through one more question and then go for extra time on the game, not on the Zoom. We've taken on a kind of contrarian, contentious topic today. What will show us whether your thesis about we're entering a supercycle is right or wrong in, say, the next 3 years?
So sort of coming back to what Reuben said earlier on, is that if you look at spending across energy, AI, and defence, it is all ramping up at a remarkable rate. So, for example, more money in the US is now being spent, probably spilt as well, on building data centres than on new office blocks. There'll be other indicators around levels of venture capital investment, energy startups, et cetera, which point to that. The balancing side of that is obviously geopolitical tension, and how do you find markets for these new products and services. But I think there's a handful of indicators that people can watch if you understand what patterns you should be looking out for and what are some of those key economic signals that would mark a turn to one direction or the other. But I think it would be unwise to ignore the thesis, because you may be discounting opportunity.
Thank you for that. I did say that was the final question, but we've got a great question that's just come through from Barbara. So let's answer that or discuss that. Barbara asks, if climate change is part of the next global growth supercycle rather than simply a risk, where do you see New Zealand's greatest strategic opportunities?
I would like Barbara to ask me a difficult question.
I'll quickly jump in. I mean, I guess there's the potential that eventually you can packet renewable energy. Somehow you can put it on a boat and you export it externally. And New Zealand can, through fusion energy or thermal energy, renewable energy, whatever, we can actually make this an export. That would be my speculation. Roger, you got anything?
So the interesting thing about New Zealand is that most of our infrastructure is coastal, like the vast majority of it. Airports, hospitals, ports, the whole lot. Ports obviously coastal, but there could be an opportunity for us to figure out robust mitigation and repositioning strategies ahead of many places in the world. But that's a difficult conversation to have in this country because people like to live, near the beach because that's the Kiwi dream. That's more challenging. But thinking about where opportunity sits in terms of coastal mitigation strategies could be an opportunity. Renewables, opportunity. Advanced weather forecasting, opportunity.
Great. That's a really upbeat note to end on, opportunity. And you've both come up with really, really great ideas and optimistic provocation for us in these often less than optimistic times. So thank you so much, Roger Dennis and Reuben Steff, for your big smart thoughts today. Thank you to everybody for the audience who tuned in, or at least double screened for this session now, or if you're watching later. And also thank you so much to Kia for hosting this session and providing us with this opportunity to talk about some big constructive ideas for how to ensure a strong future for New Zealand. So thank you so much, Tina and Zoe and Kia, and I wish everybody a good Monday if you're in New Zealand. Ka kite.